December the 8th, 1945, 08:30 hours, Comrie, Perthshire, Scotland. Oberfeldwebel Karl Richter stood in formation beneath slate-grey Scottish skies, breath visible in morning cold, hands numb despite gloves issued by British authorities. Around him, 250 German prisoners assembled for morning roll call, men from shattered Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe units captured during the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Beyond the barbed wire fence, the Perthshire hills rose dark and imposing, beautiful and utterly foreign. Karl had been at Camp 21 for 7 months, 7 months in what the British called the Black Camp of the North, designated for Category A prisoners, the hardened Nazis, the SS officers, the men considered most dangerous and fanatical. 7 months expecting the brutality promised by German propaganda. 7 months discovering that propaganda had been comprehensively wrong, but this morning brought something unprecedented. The camp commandant, a Scottish major named MacLeod, whose accent Karl could barely comprehend, stood before assembled prisoners with an announcement that seemed impossible. "Gentlemen," the major began in his careful, accented German, "Christmas approaches. Under new regulations from London, Scottish civilians may invite prisoners to their homes for Christmas dinner. Applications will be processed for prisoners with satisfactory records who wish to participate." The formation erupted in whispers. Karl stood rigid, mind refusing to process what he'd heard. Scottish civilians, whose sons and husbands the Germans had killed, whose cities the Luftwaffe had bombed, were volunteering to invite enemy prisoners into their homes for Christmas dinner. It made no sense. It contradicted everything Karl had been taught about British hatred, about democratic weakness, about the inevitable revenge awaiting captured Germans. Yet as the weeks passed, Karl would learn that in Scotland, civilization meant something different than Nazi ideology had ever acknowledged. The Black Camp. Camp 21 at Cultiebragan, constructed in 1941 near the village of Comrie, was purpose-built to house Britain's most problematic German prisoners. The facility could hold 4,000 men in rows of corrugated Nissen huts, surrounded by double barbed wire fences and guard towers that offered clear sight lines across the compound. The designation Black Camp reflected the prisoner classification system. These were the black category prisoners, considered unrepentantly Nazi, potentially dangerous, requiring maximum security. Karl's arrival in May 1945 had confirmed the camp's reputation. Fellow prisoners included SS officers from concentration camp guard units, Luftwaffe pilots who'd bombed London, U-boat crews who'd torpedoed Allied shipping, Wehrmacht officers who'd fought across Poland, France and Russia. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were men the British had every justification to treat harshly. The camp's location was strategic. Comrie sat in central Scotland, far from major cities, surrounded by mountains that made escape difficult. The nearest significant population centres were hours away. The isolation served multiple purposes. Security, yes, but also separation from civilians who might direct anger at prisoners whose forces had killed their loved ones. Yet within this maximum security facility, designed for dangerous prisoners, Karl encountered something unexpected: systematic, restrained professionalism that contradicted every warning about British revenge. The Scottish Guards. The Guards at Camp 21 were predominantly Scottish, many from Highland regiments with centuries of military tradition. These were men whose families had fought at Culloden, whose ancestors had served in British armies across the Empire, whose brothers and sons were still fighting Germans in Europe when the first prisoners arrived. Sergeant Duncan Mackenzie, who supervised Karl's section, embodied the Scottish approach to guarding enemy prisoners. A veteran of North Africa and Italy, Mackenzie had earned the military medal for actions against Rommel's Afrika Korps. He had buried friends killed by German artillery, had seen the devastation German bombing inflicted on Glasgow and other Scottish cities. Karl expected hatred from such a man. Instead, he encountered something more complex: firm discipline combined with grudging fairness and an almost aggressive insistence on maintaining standards. "You'll keep your barracks clean," Mackenzie announced in his first address to Karl's section, speaking accented German, learned specifically for guard duty. "You'll work when assigned. You'll obey orders promptly and completely. You'll not cause trouble, and you'll not receive trouble. We're not savages, though God knows you fought for savages. We maintain civilized standards because we're civilized men, which is why we beat you. Is that understood?" The men nodded, uncertain what to make of this approach. Mackenzie continued, "You'll receive fair treatment, not because you earned it, most of you fought for evil, but because Scottish soldiers maintain proper standards regardless of circumstances. That's the difference between us and what you served." This philosophy, treating prisoners properly as demonstration of moral superiority rather than kindness, characterized the Scottish approach to Camp 21st. Guards didn't fraternize, but they didn't abuse. Orders were clear and enforced consistently. Violations resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but never violence. The contrast with German military culture was stark. Karl had witnessed how German forces treated prisoners, particularly on the Eastern Front. He'd seen the casual brutality, the deliberate starvation, the summary executions. The Scottish restraint in dealing with men who'd fought for such a system was psychologically disorienting. The village. Comrie sat 2 miles from Camp 21, a small Scottish village of perhaps 800 residents, whose men had gone to war like men across Britain. The village had sent sons to North Africa, Italy, France. Gold stars in windows marked homes where those sons wouldn't return. The local war memorial listed names from the First World War. New names would be added after this one ended. The village's initial response to having 4,000 German prisoners nearby was predictably hostile. These were the enemy. These were men whose forces had killed British soldiers, bombed British cities, fought for a regime whose evil was becoming clearer as Allied forces liberated concentration camps. Yet practical necessity created contact. The camp required civilian workers for maintenance, administration, and supplies. Prisoners worked on local farms, addressing Scotland's severe agricultural labour shortage. These interactions forced proximity between people who had every reason to hate each other. Mrs. Jean Fraser ran a small shop in Comrie that supplied items to the camp. Her son James had died at Monte Cassino in 1944, killed by German artillery. When German prisoners first began arriving for supervised work details in the village, she refused to serve them, wouldn't look at them, maintained rigid hostility. But over months, something shifted. The German prisoners who worked on nearby farms were unfailingly polite. They worked diligently, didn't cause trouble, seemed genuinely grateful for fair treatment. One prisoner, noticing the gold star in her window, removed his cap and stood silently for a moment before entering her shop, a gesture of respect that cost him nothing but meant something to a grieving mother. This gradual humanization occurred across Comrie. Villagers who initially viewed prisoners with undifferentiated hatred began distinguishing between the Nazis as abstract evil and the German lads working on MacGregor's farm who seemed like ordinary young men caught in history's machinery. The transformation wasn't universal or complete. Some villagers maintained justified anger throughout, but enough shifted enough that when Christmas 1946 approached and new regulations permitted civilians to invite prisoners for holiday dinners, multiple Comrie families volunteered to participate. The work details. German prisoners from Camp 21 worked primarily on agricultural details, addressing Scotland's desperate labour shortage. With millions of British men in military service, Scottish farms faced critical worker deficits during crucial planting and harvest seasons. Karl was assigned to a work detail at Drummond Farm, owned by Robert and Margaret Drummond, whose 2 sons were serving in British forces in Germany. The assignment was practical. The Drummonds needed labour, the prisoners needed work to occupy time and earn small wages. The work was hard. Carl, a clerk before the war, had never farmed. Scottish agriculture in winter was cold, muddy, physically demanding. But it was honest work, and the British provided adequate tools, clear instruction, and fair supervision. Robert Drummond was stern, expectations high, tolerance for laziness non-existent, but he was also scrupulously fair. He demonstrated tasks properly, provided guidance when prisoners struggled, brought tea during breaks regardless of weather. When Carl slipped in mud and twisted his ankle, Drummond arranged immediate medical attention and adjusted his duties until he healed. "You'll work honestly and I'll treat you honestly," Drummond stated simply on Carl's first day. "I don't like what your country did. My sons are in Germany dealing with the aftermath of your war, but you're here to work and I need the work done, so we'll manage." This practical Scottish approach, acknowledging reality while maintaining fairness, characterized many prisoner-civilian interactions. The work created daily contact that gradually eroded propaganda's dehumanization on both sides. Margaret Drummond began bringing additional food for work details, extra sandwiches, occasionally cake, thermoses of hot tea beyond what regulations required. Small gestures of human decency that cost little but meant everything to men far from home, uncertain of their futures. The letters home. Prisoners at Camp 21 could write letters to families in Germany, subject to censorship. These letters provided the first accurate information many German civilians received about POW treatment in British camps. Karl's letter to his wife Greta in Hamburg, written in October 1945, stated, "I am well and healthy. The Scots treat us firmly but fairly. We work on farms. The food is adequate. We are not beaten or abused. The camp is clean and organized. Everything we were told about British brutality was lies. I am safer here than Germany is now. Do not believe the propaganda about prisoner treatment." Greta, living in bombed Hamburg under Soviet occupation, shared the letter with neighbors. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment had been false, what else were lies? The claims about miracle weapons that would turn the tide, the promises of inevitable victory, the entire ideological foundation that had cost Germany everything, these letters rippled through German civilian populations, undermining remaining faith in Nazi pronouncements. British censors understood this strategic value. Letters from well-treated prisoners served as psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda broadcasts. The transformation. Extended captivity in Scottish camps created ideological transformations among many German prisoners. The process was gradual, painful, and profound. Karl had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, believing Nazi ideology about German superiority, Jewish conspiracy, and the necessity of war. He'd fought through Poland and France, witnessed atrocities, rationalized them as regrettable necessities. The propaganda had been constant and comprehensive, but months at Camp 21 created cognitive dissonance impossible to ignore. The British treated prisoners with firm fairness despite having every justification for revenge. Scottish civilians who'd lost sons gradually extended grudging humanity to enemy prisoners. The system worked through order and discipline rather than terror and brutality. One evening in the barracks, Karl talked with Helmut Stenger, a former U-boat officer from Bremen. "We were told the British were decadent and weak," Helmut said quietly. "That democracy made people soft, that they'd collapse under pressure. Instead, they maintained civilized standards while defeating us completely. They're neither weak nor decadent. They're stronger than we were because they don't require brutality to maintain order." This realization spread through the camp. The prisoners had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement. They read British newspapers, heavily censored, but still providing information never available in Nazi Germany. They talked among themselves, gradually admitting what they'd witnessed and participated in. British authorities recognised this transformation potential. Captain Herbert Sulzbach, himself a German Jewish refugee who'd fled Nazi persecution and joined the British Army, was assigned to Camp 21 to facilitate prisoner re-education. Sulzbach, who'd fought for Germany in the First World War and earned an Iron Cross before having to flee the regime he'd once served, had unique credibility with prisoners. Sulzbach didn't lecture about democracy or denounce Nazism directly. Instead, he created opportunities for prisoners to reach their own conclusions through exposure to information and reality. He organized discussion groups, provided access to uncensored news about concentration camps and Nazi atrocities, and facilitated conversations about what Germany had become. The transformations weren't universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis, refused re-education, maintained ideological allegiance, but many, including Karl, painfully rebuilt their understanding. They'd fought for evil. They'd believed lies. The civilization that defeated and imprisoned them was more honourable than the regime they'd served. The Christmas Invitation. In late November 1946, new regulations permitted Scottish civilians to invite prisoners with good records to their homes for Christmas dinner. The policy was controversial. Many British citizens understandably opposed welcoming enemy prisoners into family celebrations, but it reflected official belief that humanising contact served long-term reconciliation objectives. Robert and Margaret Drummond discussed the matter over several evenings. Their sons were still in Germany with occupying forces. The war's memories were fresh, friends lost, cities bombed, years of sacrifice and fear. Inviting German prisoners for Christmas seemed almost offensive to those losses. But Margaret, thinking of her sons far from home on Christmas, considered what she'd want others to show them. "They're young men far from their families," she said finally. "They worked honestly on our farm. The war's over. Perhaps showing humanity to former enemies is how we ensure future peace." Robert, after long silence, nodded. "We'll invite Karl and Helmut. They've been good workers. It's Christmas. We're Christians. That should mean something." When Sergeant Mackenzie informed Karl of the Drummond's invitation, Karl couldn't speak. He'd expected to spend Christmas in the barracks, perhaps with a special meal and permission for religious services. The prospect of Christmas dinner in a Scottish home, with a family whose sons he might have fought against, seemed surreal. "You're not required to accept," Mackenzie clarified. "It's voluntary, but the Drummonds are good people. They've invited you and Stenger specifically. I'd recommend accepting if you're comfortable." Karl accepted, as did Helmut, though both felt profound uncertainty about what such an evening would entail. Christmas Day, 1946. Christmas morning at Camp 21 began with Protestant and Catholic services in the camp chapel, a wooden structure where prisoners gathered for worship. The services were quiet and emotional, men far from home, uncertain futures, singing German hymns in Scottish winter. After services, Karl and Helmut were released under guard escort to walk to Drummond Farm. The countryside was beautiful, despite winter cold, rolling hills, frost on trees, quiet that felt almost sacred after years of war's chaos. At the Drummond farmhouse, Margaret met them at the door. "Welcome," she said simply in English, then gestured them inside, where warmth and cooking smells created immediate sensory contrast with barracks life. The evening began awkwardly. The Drummonds, Karl and Helmut, sat in the parlour, conversation stilted through language barriers and emotional complexity. Robert attempted English mixed with fragments of German. Karl and Helmut responded in broken English they'd learned working. Margaret brought tea and biscuits, traditional Scottish hospitality, overcoming initial discomfort. Gradually, conversation developed. Robert asked about farming in Germany. Karl described his family's small garden in Hamburg, now likely destroyed by bombing. Helmut talked about his hometown in Bremen, also devastated. The Drummonds shared news from their sons, letters describing occupied Germany, the destruction, the desperate civilians. "Your cities are destroyed," Robert said without satisfaction. "Our cities were bombed too, but nothing like what Germany faces now. It's a tragedy what war does to ordinary people." This acknowledgement that German civilian suffering was tragedy rather than justified punishment affected Karl deeply. The Drummonds had lost friends to German bombs, yet they expressed genuine regret for destruction Germany had suffered. Dinner was traditional Scottish Christmas fare, roast chicken, meat being still rationed but saved for holidays, potatoes, vegetables from the Drummonds' garden, Christmas pudding with custard. For Karl and Helmut, accustomed to adequate but basic camp rations, the meal was extraordinary. But beyond the food, the experience of sharing a family Christmas with former enemies created profound emotional impact. Margaret spoke of her sons, showing photographs, expressing hope they'd return home safely. Robert talked about farming, about community, about rebuilding after war's devastation. They didn't pretend the war hadn't happened or minimize German responsibility, but they treated their guests as human beings, deserving basic dignity. After dinner, they listened to Christmas carols on the radio, both English and German versions of familiar hymns. When Silent Night played in German, Margaret quietly wept, thinking of her sons far from home. Karl, seeing her grief, felt crushing guilt for his role in the war that had caused such universal suffering. Before Karl and Helmut returned to camp, Margaret gave them small packages, chocolate, cigarettes, small luxuries. "Happy Christmas," she said simply. "We pray this is the last Christmas anyone spends away from home because of war." Walking back to Camp 21 in darkness, Karl couldn't speak. Finally, Helmut said what they both felt. "We don't deserve such kindness." Karl nodded. "No, but perhaps that's the point. They're showing us what civilization actually means, extending humanity even to enemies who don't deserve it. That's something we never understood." The ripple effect. The Christmas invitations of 1946 weren't isolated incidents. Across Scotland, dozens of families invited German prisoners for holiday dinners. Some encounters were awkward, others surprisingly warm. All created human connections that contradicted years of propaganda and hatred. In Comrie specifically, the Drummonds' example encouraged other families to extend similar invitations in subsequent years. Some prisoners formed lasting friendships with Scottish families, maintaining correspondence for decades after repatriation. The policy's success validated British authorities' belief that humanizing contact served reconciliation objectives. Prisoners who experienced Scottish hospitality returned to Germany with changed perspectives about democratic civilization. Many became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany, having learned from captivity that civilized values weren't weakness but strength. Helmut Stenger later wrote about the Christmas invitation. "In no way was I prepared for what was done for me during Christmas Day by the Drummond family. They had every reason to hate me. Their sons were occupying my defeated country, yet they welcomed me into their home, fed me, treated me with dignity I didn't deserve. That evening taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did." The voluntary returns. When prisoner repatriation began in 1947-48, thousands of German POWs volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily to continue agricultural work. The British government, facing continued labour shortages, permitted volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Karl was among those who chose to remain. Hamburg was rubble, his family scattered, prospects uncertain. Britain offered work, stability, and surprising acceptance. He continued at Drummond Farm as paid civilian worker, living in converted farm buildings rather than the camp. The transformation from enemy prisoner to voluntary worker demonstrated the success of British POW policy. Men treated fairly during captivity chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. The system's humanity created practical benefits beyond abstract moral satisfaction. Karl worked at Drummond Farm until 1949, when he finally returned to Hamburg to help rebuild. He maintained correspondence with the Drummonds until Margaret's death in 1978 and Robert's in 1982. He named his first son Robert, explaining to him years later about the Scottish family that had shown humanity to a defeated enemy. The Scottish legacy. The treatment of German POWs in Scotland reflected deeply held Scottish values about fairness, discipline, and community responsibility. Scottish culture emphasized both toughness and fairness. You maintained strict standards, but treated people justly within those standards. The guards at Camp 21 exemplified this approach. They weren't kind to prisoners, but they were scrupulously fair. They didn't abuse power, didn't permit arbitrary cruelty, maintained professional distance while ensuring proper treatment. Scottish civilians who extended hospitality to prisoners did so from practical Christianity and belief in reconciliation. They didn't forget what Germans had done, but they recognized that perpetual hatred served no one. The war was over. The work of peace required different approaches than the work of war. This Scottish approach to former enemies, firm but fair, remembering wrongs but extending second chances, contributed to successful reconstruction of democratic Germany. Prisoners who experienced Scottish fairness returned home as advocates for democracy, having learned that civilized values produced stronger societies than Nazi ideology ever achieved. The lasting memory. For German veterans who experienced Scottish captivity, the memory of fair treatment in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable remained defining experiences. Karl Richter, who lived until 2003, maintained that the Christmas dinner at Drummond Farm changed his life more profoundly than any battle. In a 1998 interview, he reflected, "The Scots could have treated us brutally. We'd fought against them, supported a regime that committed atrocities, caused immense suffering. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they maintained civilized standards because their values required it, not because we deserved it. That restraint, that adherence to principles even when dealing with enemies, taught me what civilization actually means. The Drummonds welcomed me into their home during Christmas when their sons were occupying my defeated country. That act of humanity, extended to someone who didn't earn it, demonstrated strength more powerful than any brutality could. I learned what democracy and civilization really mean, not from books, but from experiencing their practice by people who maintained their values even toward defeated enemies." The Silent Testament. Camp 21 at Colty-Bragan stands today as Scotland's last remaining World War II POW camp, preserved as historical site and community resource. The Nissen huts remain, weathered but intact, silent testimony to the thousands of German prisoners who spent years behind barbed wire in Scottish mountains. Visitors to the site today learn about the camp's history, its role housing dangerous prisoners, the escape attempts, the daily routines, the gradual transformation from hostile imprisonment to grudging coexistence to surprising reconciliation. The camp's chapel, where prisoners gathered for Christmas services, now houses the Comrie Centre for Peace and Reconciliation, dedicated to promoting understanding and preventing future conflicts. The building represents transformation, from place of captivity to symbol of reconciliation. Local historians in Comrie preserve stories of prisoner-civilian interactions, the work details, the Christmas invitations, the friendships that formed across enemy lines. These stories complicate simple narratives about war and peace, demonstrating that even after terrible conflict, humanity can emerge through consistent fairness and deliberate choice. The Quiet Triumph. The Scottish treatment of German POWs represented strategic victory beyond military defeat of Nazi Germany. Scotland demonstrated that civilization could maintain moral standards under war's pressures, that democratic society could fight total war without abandoning civilized values, that victors could treat defeated enemies with dignity. These weren't weakness, they were strength. The firm fairness that characterized Camp 21's operation proved that order didn't require brutality, that discipline could coexist with decency, that treating enemies properly when you defeated them showed greater civilization than any revenge could demonstrate. For the German prisoners who expected brutality but received fairness, who anticipated starvation but received adequate food, who feared torture but experienced professional treatment, the Scottish camps became their first real encounter with functioning democratic civilization. Sergeant Duncan Mackenzie, who supervised German prisoners throughout the war and into repatriation, reflected in 1982. "We beat them fairly on battlefield, then we treated them like defeated soldiers rather than animals. We didn't do it because they deserved it. Many had fought for terrible evil. We did it because Scottish values required it. We showed them what civilization means by maintaining standards even toward enemies. That's how you win wars properly. Defeat them militarily, then show them through your behavior what they were really fighting against." The Christmas message. The image of German prisoners sitting at Scottish family tables for Christmas dinner, sharing meals with families whose sons they might have fought against, captures something essential about reconciliation's possibility even after terrible conflict. Margaret Drummond's tears listening to Silent Night in German while hosting enemy prisoners who'd fought against her sons. Robert Drummond passing bread to men whose forces had bombed British cities. Carl and Helmut experiencing hospitality they knew they hadn't earned from people who had every reason to refuse it. These moments of shared humanity didn't erase the war's horrors or minimize German responsibility, but they demonstrated that after conflict ends, peace requires different courage than war demands. The courage to extend humanity to former enemies, to treat defeated foes with dignity, to believe reconciliation serves everyone's interests better than perpetual hatred. The Scottish winter evenings, when German prisoners gathered for Christmas services, singing hymns in their native language while Scottish guards stood respectfully outside. The farm work details where German prisoners and Scottish farmers developed grudging respect through shared labour. The Christmas dinners where former enemies shared food and tentative conversation about rebuilding after devastation. These quiet moments of connection across enemy lines, these choices to maintain civilized standards when circumstances would have justified brutality, these deliberate decisions to treat prisoners as human beings rather than categories. This was Scotland's contribution to winning not just the war, but also the peace that followed. The grey Scottish mornings when German prisoners received fair treatment from guards who'd lost friends to German weapons. The cold Perthshire winter when Scottish civilians invited enemy prisoners into their homes for Christmas dinner. The transformation of hardened Nazi prisoners into men who questioned everything they'd believed and eventually became advocates for democracy they'd once despised. This was the quiet triumph of civilization over barbarism, achieved not through matching Nazi brutality, but through maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies, proving through consistent action that democratic values weren't weakness, but foundation of lasting victory.